I apologize for the lack of visual stimuli. There won't be any PowerPoint with this, I'm afraid. You just have to rely upon your ears. Okay, and I'm not going to improvise. I'm just going to read the paper, Out of Time's Joint. This is my earlier book, by the way, Philip K. Dick, 1988. And I have a blog, Cubiquity, Quubikuity, at blogspot.com. Out of Time's Joint. The two fundamental questions in Philip K. Dick's work are commonly said to be, what does it mean to be human, and what is reality? Many critical discussions, including Dick's own self-analyses, have turned on these two questions. Dick said they were really two aspects of the same question, two sides of the same coin. I would also propose a third side of the coin. What is time? Dick had a good deal to say on the subject of time. Not only is it a key theme and plot element in many of his novels and stories, but it was central to the philosophy that he enunciated in Valis and the Exegesis. There are three basic interpretations of time we get from physics. The first is Newtonian. Time is conceived as an unchanging absolute background for physical reality. This is the common sense view, which physicist Julian Barber characterizes as some invisible river that flows uniformly forever. Such a notion seems appropriate for the world of everyday experience, in which time is experienced in linear fashion, in the familiar form of a definitive past, present, and future common to all viewpoints. However, as Newtonian physics proved inadequate to describe the world of the very large and the very small, the 20th century brought a revolution in reconceptualizing time and space. And that brought about the second interpretation, relativistic. In this model, time is an aspect of four-dimensional space-time, which is warped by the presence of mass. Time is also relative to the motion of the observer. The famous twins paradox is an example of relativistic Einsteinian time. If Bob and Sue are twins, and Bob gets on a spaceship leaving Earth and travels close to the speed of light, when he returns to Earth, he'll have aged many more years than Sue has. This is because time slows down for an object in motion, although it is only when its speed approaches that of light that the effect is very noticeable. The relativistic theory of space-time undermines the complacency of the common sense referential mind. The third standard interpretation of time comes from quantum physics. Quantum reality is often used synonymously to refer to the quirky subatomic world. Quantum physics further contradicts conventional notions of time and space and cause and effect in finding instantaneous connections between physical objects widely separated in space, a notion which caused vexation to Einstein. A promising path for the grand unification of quantum theory with relativity is the study of higher dimensional superstrings, and which may get us closer to the Holy Grail, the theory of everything. Based on the incredibly tiny Planck scale, the smallest unit of time is the time it takes a photon traveling at the speed of light to travel the Planck length of 1.616253 times 10 to the minus 35 meters. That's about 10 sextillionths the length of a single proton. Smaller than that, matter completely disappears in a foam of virtual quantum fluctuations. This is also the home of the famous so-called God particle, or Higgs boson. There are no minutes, hours, or seconds there. The human brain can know things that are beyond belief. It can perform calculations in an instant beyond the capabilities of any supercomputer. So, possibly, it can apprehend that tiny slice of Planck time, and from that, eventually construct the feeling sense of minutes, hours, and days. Neurophysiologist Stuart Hameroff and mathematician Roger Penrose have a theory that the microtubule, molecular structures in the brain demonstrate quantum behavior and are basically responsible for consciousness, which in its endlessly mercurial nature can be regarded as a quantum phenomenon. And now to Dick. In his essay, "If You Find This World Bad, You Should See Some of the Others," he writes, "We are accustomed to supposing that all change takes place along the linear time axis, from past to present to future. The present is an accrual of the past and is different from it. The future will accrue from the present and be different yet. That an orthogonal or right-angled time axis could exist, a lateral domain in which change takes place, processes occurring sideways in reality, so to speak, this is almost impossible to imagine. How would we perceive such lateral changes? What would we experience? What clues, if we are trying to test out this bizarre theory, should we be on the alert for? In other words, how can change take place outside linear time at all, in any sense, to any degree? He further elaborates in a Frank Bertrand interview. For instance, let's take that TV set there. And now that TV set occurs in linear time. It is brought into the room and set down, and we perceive this occur. But orthogonal time sweeps out like this, adding each time, and then we would think this set had always been here because it's here now. What I mean is we would have the linear coming into existence because the coming into existence is in a passing way. That is, the moving from past to present and future is linear, but in orthogonal time, linear time occurs, strikes all of linear time simultaneously. It strikes the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. It has no reference to the way we divide up time into past, present, and future. So we would be unaware of a transformation along the orthogonal axis. End quote. Modern-day physics takes for granted much more than we can reconcile with common sense. To assimilate the more open-ended view of space-time implied in the Einsteinian worldview, we need to break the shackles of the relentlessly linear time sense. The timeline, or what we read into it, is an illusion. It is the edge of a reality which we cannot grasp. The edge of the page is linear. Okay. The coded text written on the page itself represents real time. Now let's look at some of Dick's novels and see how they describe transformative events in the lives of people confronted with temporal flux that uproots them from linear time. Counterclock World, first published in 1967, has a more serious and darker tone than most of Dick's earlier works. It is an ambitious novel, underread and underrated in the Dick canon, that looks backward and forward simultaneously. The premise is that time has started to run backwards due to something called the Hobart phase. Dead people come back to life in their graves. Living people grow continually younger until they re-enter their mother's wombs. Food is regurgitated into its original form. And while eating is considered obscene, waste, or sogum, is imbibed through tubes in public. People say goodbye when they greet each other and hello when they part. Critics have derided Dick's use of time reversal as completely illogical and inconsistent. But that doesn't seem to matter, really. The novel's serious concerns about the frailty of life and love in the face of monolithic external forces lifted above its own contrivances, because what matters is the human response to temporality. In Einstein's relativity, it is permissible theoretically to go backward in time, but on the level of reality that we inhabit, this behavior is not seen because of something called time's arrow. This means that time moves only one way, towards a state of greater entropy and disorder. We do not observe eggs going back into their shells, for example, because according to the second law of thermodynamics, that would be going from a state of greater disorder, the broken egg, to a state of greater order, the unbroken egg. However, in Counterclock World, Dick tackles the supposedly impossible nature of time reversal against the arrow of time's direction. People disgorge their food into its original form as so-called victuals, now regarded with disgust. Sex is no longer an occasion for conception, but for reabsorption of the sperm and egg. Libraries are places where books are destroyed and ideas eradicated. I happen to like this tragically toned book, but this is not one of Dick's more popular novels, and one can see why. A lot of readers are bothered by the so-called inconsistencies implicit in the plot device of time reversal because time's arrow reversal effects are inherently awkward. The details of a reversed digestive system are not enchanting to contemplate. And furthermore, Dick kills off two of his three main characters in the book. So the supposed conquering of death in the Hobart phase seems meaningless. Plus, there are a lot of odd theological references throughout, from the likes of St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Origena, and Boethius, which are meant to represent the trans-temporal philosophy of the anarch Peak, a modern prophet rescued from his grave in the novel. This places the mixture of elements into a mystical context, typical of other late 60s PKD, with the result that readers will tend to be confused about what the book is saying and tend to find it more or less indigestible. Even with time reversal, Counterclock World is still about linear time. It may be looped and twisted unrecognizably, but psychologically people adapt and respond in a linear way to events as they present themselves. The characters do not break through into orthogonal time. This is why in the exegesis Dick hardly mentions Counterclock World. This is because it is not a transcendental narrative such as Ubik. Quoting the exegesis, "Time is about to end, lineal time, as a factor of life. It won't reverse as in Counterclock World, but our present will dissolve as all the accretion of at least 3,500 years will vanish, as if dreamlike. They never took place." This quote shows Dick's recurrent belief that time presents itself in layers, and that the layer that we are living in is basically an illusory one. That is, of course, the source of the oft-repeated phrase, "The empire never ended." We are living in ancient Roman times, which is covered with a thin veneer of modernity. Time Out of Joint, first published all the way back in 1959, neatly anticipates the time juxtaposition that was part of Dick's pink light experiences of 2374. In this early novel, the character Regal Gum discovers that he is living in 1997 instead of 1957, as he thought. The famous scene where a soft drink stand simply vanishes to be replaced by a slip of paper that says soft drink stand is a great metaphor for the insubstantiality of the false time layer. People are basically hypnotized to believe they are living in the simple, peaceful, mindless, small-town world of the 50s, when actually they are living in a war zone 40 years later. It's a metaphor for how people superimpose a reductive, shrunken timeline on their real-time circumstances. There is a dreamlike quality to Dick's 1950s, and a certain slow, unreal texture to time itself. We see it in most of Dick's 50s mainstream novels. It may be that we can start reading them as SF, recognizing them as an alternative reality story about a world that only seemed to be, much like the illusory reality of Time Out of Joint or the alternate history of Man in the High Castle. Time Out of Joint begins very, very slowly, but once Regal Gum wakes up to the full extent of the fake reality that has been constructed to keep his mind on the business of solving the newspaper puzzle Where is the Little Green Man, which holds the key to where the lunar colonists' missiles will land, the story quickly races to what some feel is a peremptory conclusion. I don't see this shift as an artistic flaw at all. I mean, what better way, in fact, to show that time has really changed and the nature of reality itself has shifted? On one level, it's a relativistic time shift in the Einsteinian sense. The perspective of the protagonist, Regal Gum, changes, detaching itself from the collective, and in so doing it assumes its own inertial frame with its own altered spatio-temporal coordinates. Incidents like the disappearance of the soft drink stand represent a kind of temporal breakdown in which the character exits the consensual temporal matrix and falls through it orthogonally into an uncharted zone rife with new possibilities and new modes of perception. But the new frame of reference is not just equivocal or different. It is of a higher order ontologically speaking. When Regel goes off by himself alone at the end, out of the sphere of Earth's collective consciousness, Dick is showing us someone who is waking up, experiencing an anamnesis, as he puts it in the exegesis, or recollection of an original condition that is of a higher order reality. As Dick puts it, anamnesis is nothing less than realizing what and where you really are. You perceive the brain and its traffic, you hear the voice of its noos, and you understand the irreality of psyche, world, causality, and time. Understanding the irreality of time becomes the preface for understanding the reality of time. It is clear from the exegesis that the nature of time is an overriding question for Dick, how to reveal its truth, not simply transcend it. For there is something in the nature of time, orthogonal, multidimensional time, not false linear time, that holds the key to higher knowledge, to gnosis. Now Wait for Last Year is the quintessential Dick novel. It has everything: drugs, time travel, alternate realities, insectoid aliens, talking taxicabs, all too human world leaders, toxic marriages. All the essential ingredients of the PKD mid-60s recipe for mind-boggling SF. Unlike Time Out of Joint, it deals in formal time paradox, not merely temporal juxtaposition, and it ties one's mind into so many recursive time loops that it almost seems that the author is out to torture the reader, throwing him into a state of temporal disorientation. The drug JJ180 sends the user into either the past or the future and gives one the power to change the collective reality. As in Eye in the Sky, where a single individual's belief system becomes the reference point for the collective reality of a group of characters, here, collective reality is changed by interventions in the timeline. Dr. Eric Sweetscent is personal physician to Gino Molinari, UN Secretary and most powerful man in the world. Nicknamed the Mole, Molinari has the empathetic ability to manifest symptoms of the diseases suffered by the people around him. Using JJ180, he keeps himself in power by bringing back other Molinaris from different time tracks to take his place whenever he either dies of his empathically acquired diseases or is assassinated. Because of his ability to perpetuate his power, Earth is finally able to extricate itself from its unwise involvement in interstellar war. And the constant disease susceptibility gives him an out from the hell of eternal recurrence on the original timeline. Dr. Sweetscent, for his part, tries to use JJ180 to communicate with future versions of himself. At the same time, he is trying to disentangle himself from his wife, who is hooked on the drug and has maliciously addicted him also. One acquaintance, observing them together, says, "Well, that's marriage these days. Legalized hate." But, try as he may, Eric cannot extricate himself emotionally from the relationship. Finally, in one of Dick's most famous scenes, he decides instead of committing suicide, Sweetscent decides instead of committing suicide to take the advice of a robot taxicab. To the cab, he said suddenly, "If your wife were sick." "I have no wife, sir," the cab said. "Automatic mechanisms never marry. Everybody knows that." "All right," Eric agreed. "If you were me and your wife were sick, desperately so, with no hope of recovery, would you leave her? Or would you stay with her, even if you had traveled 10 years into the future and knew for an absolute certainty that the damage to her brain could never be reversed? And staying with her would mean—" "I can see what you mean, sir," the cab broke in. "It would mean no other life for you beyond caring for her." "That's right," Eric said. "I'd stay with her," the cab decided. "Why?" "Because," the cab said, "life is composed of reality configurations so constituted. To abandon her would be to say, I can't endure reality as such. I have to have uniquely special, easier conditions." "I think I agree," Eric said after a time. "I think I will stay with her." "God bless you, sir," the cab said. "I can see that you're a good man." On one hand, then, we have the Molinari Approach. He uses JJ 180 to break out of the fatality of history and linear time and borrow from other possible universes for the benefit of his own. On the other, we have the Doctor, who is tempted by the possibility of release through the drug from his unredeemed life in an imperfect world, but ultimately decides to play with the hand that has been dealt him. Thus, life is composed of reality configurations so constituted. Even when those configurations include alternate past and future timelines in a way that seems to render temporal reality irreal, there is woven through them an underlying field of real time which we cannot necessarily see because it is orthogonal. It participates in a multidimensional matrix in which our phenomenal world is enfolded. Martian time slip has schizophrenia as its overriding motif. But time is a critical factor in the analysis of the mental pathology in the novel. In the opening, in the theory operating here, which Dick derived from the writings of Swiss existential psychiatrists, the schizophrenic has a different frame of reference in time, and his clock runs faster than the sane inhabitant of mundane time. The main characters of this novel include Arnie Cott, the rich, ruthless head of the Plumbers Union on Mars, a no-nonsense opportunist who represents the epitome of lineal reality or baseline normal. There's also Jack Bolan, a talented electrical repairman who is borderline schizophrenic. Then there's Manfred Steiner, a precognitive boy who is thoroughly schizophrenic and has the power to alter time. Also important here are the Bleakmen, who are the Martian natives, who, like Australian Bushmen, have one foot in another reality, a form of dream time or extra-dimensional orthogonal time. They understand that Manfred, warped as he is, has access to a visionary mode of apprehending reality. Heliogabulus, Arnie's tame Bleakman, comments, "Who can say if perhaps the schizophrenics are not correct? Mister, they take a brave journey. They turn away from mere things, which one may handle and turn to practical use. They turn inward to meaning." Martian time slip is hardly a sanguine portrayal of schizophrenia, however. It is as nightmarish as one might conceive, and at the root of the problem is the loss of identity in the mazes of linear time. This timeline becomes looped and twisted by the power of Manfred's overriding consciousness. Dick also wrote A Crack in Space. This is about a crack in time, which once it opens, it is not a pleasant place to hang. Arnie, rather than attempting to understand Manfred's schizophrenia, tries to exploit the boy for his precognitive ability with disastrous consequences. All the characters are sucked into a time loop where Arnie relives a segment of his life over and over through Manfred's time-altering power and begins to perceive as the boy does. Suddenly, the world is hostile. His secretary turns into a lascivious machine with sadistic teeth. The newspaper he tries to read quickly turns into gubble-gubble words. His paranoia makes him attempt to kill Jack Bolan, whom Arnie imagines is responsible for his problems. In doing so, he is shot by a Bleakman arrow and dies, but only in his hallucination. Then, when he gets transported to his supposedly sane primary reality, he is killed again, this time for real, but dies thinking he is still trapped in one of Manfred's schizophrenic worlds. Having lost his temporal bearings, he can't navigate. The underpinnings of his very identity crumble, and in death he becomes authentically psychotic himself. Whereas Jack Bolan, at the end of the novel, has become healed. He is returned to his wife after the affair with Arnie's secretary, and similar to Eric Sweetson in Now Wait for Last Year, finds a renewed sense of purpose and connection. As Shakespeare's Hamlet said enigmatically, "I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams." Each Dick character's nutshell has its own integrity and self-definition, but it always contains cracks. And sooner or later, they crack wide open to reveal an infinite stage to strut and fret out a switched-on consciousness, a realm of higher knowledge that is sometimes too terrible to bear, as in the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and at other times redeeming, as in Ubik. PKD is not just playing with space-time paradoxes in a psychedelic way to blow your mind. He is presenting a treatise on a different level of reality, not just a mode of temporal existence. He He doesn't just show how time can be bent by relativity or become twisted in a maze of quantum paradoxes, but shows time as a field that underlies our experience orthogonally. It interacts with consciousness in a symbiotic relationship. Objectivity and subjectivity become enmeshed in a dimensional dance flickering across the floor of time.